during Operation Sindoor is under the garb of trying to fight misinformation and disinformation. The government put together very well-curated, well-crafted narratives. It was pushed, and journalists didn't have enough access to verify it or even question it. So tell us what it is to report on conflicts at times like these.
We know that Indian media reported that there was a coup in Pakistan. General Asim Munir was in jail, the Pakistani Prime Minister was in a bunker. I mean, it actually reported. So we faced this sustained efforts to provide misinformation throughout the conflict, and which did not advance India's interests at all. On the other side, Indian TV, Indian media came out very, very bad.
I want to ask you, Nirupama, about what's happening on the other side of the border. There's so much curiosity because as somebody who's reported from Pakistan.
While in India, people think that we emerged victorious from Operation Sindoor, or that is a narrative being put out by the government. On the other side, it's that Pakistan won this war.
How do you navigate through this competitive nationalism where journalists, anchors are perhaps the biggest warmongers of our times?
The journalists are actually making things much, much worse for Indian state interests, even if that is the mission that they are carrying when they go abroad. And the term Godi media is very widely used and very widely understood in Nepal as well. Godi media is now world famous, right?
How you're trained, the safety protocols, if you can just tell us.
I worked with the National News Network and we covered the 2008 Mumbai attack. And I remember literally sort of being outside these places where gunshots were going off, and we had no protective gear, we had no training whatsoever in terms of how to manage these. And frankly, there were so many journalists outside of the Taj Hotel that honestly, if somebody had just popped their head out of a window and thrown a grenade, there would have been a lot of journalist killed.
The conflict in Israel and Palestine, which is now a full-blown genocide, did not start on the 7th of October.
Mostly European or Western diplomats or government ministers, they will criticize Israel, and at the moment they will also say that Israel has the right to defend itself, as if what is going on in Gaza is Israel defending itself. Against whom? That's the question. 2.3 million people. Before the October 7 attack happened, some 200 Palestinians were shot at by the Israeli military.
The next session is going to be on From Operation Sindoor to International Conflicts, Lessons for the Media. Back in May, Operation Sindoor dominated headlines across the country. Back in the race to break the news first, many outlets overlooked one of journalism's core responsibilities: verification. This challenge is not just unique to India, and it plays out time and again in newsrooms across the world. This session will explore how journalists can navigate the fog of war and report responsibly, even when propaganda runs deep. The panel will also reflect on lessons from both the Indian and international conflicts, touching on misinformation, state pressures, on-ground safety, and the challenge of retaining public interest. We are joined by a panel of 4 accomplished journalists. The first one is Nirupama Subramanian, an award-winning independent journalist based in Chennai with decades of experience as a reporter and editor for multiple reputed news organizations across Islamabad, Colombo, Chandigarh, and Mumbai. Roman Gautam from Kathmandu has over a decade of experience in magazine journalism in South Asia. He's the editor of Himal Southasian and earlier spent 9 years at The Caravan, where he served as senior editor. Stanly Johny, International Affairs Editor at The Hindu, author of 3 acclaimed books on geopolitics. Stanley has written extensively on foreign policy and reported from different parts of the world. Yogita Limaye, South Asia and Afghanistan correspondent for BBC News, a 2-time Emmy winner, Yogita has reported extensively from Afghanistan, Ukraine, Myanmar, and other global conflict zones. To moderate this important discussion, we have with us Pooja Prasanna, editorial head for reporting at the News Minute, where she focuses on politics and social justice. With over 15 years of experience across broadcast, digital, and print journalism, Pooja has covered major news events across South India. Please join me in welcoming the panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Zifa. Thank you for all of you. This is a post-lunch session, and it's a very heavy topic, so brace yourselves. I can't think of a more accomplished, a more diverse panel to discuss war and conflict than what I have on stage. And perhaps a more inadequate moderator, because I have not reported on any active conflict. And I come to this conversation as somebody who believes as I think any sane person would, that war is terrible. It's a failure of society. It's a failure of dialogue. But I know that I share that sentiment with all my panelists, and that is a great starting point for us to have this conversation. But I also think the fact that I've not been in the dust of war would perhaps help me ask questions that many of us would have about what it means to be in a conflict zone and reporting on war. So we'll not just talk about Operation Sindoor and the wars that we've seen over the last few years, but we'll try to go beyond the logistics of war, the troop movement, the strategies and all of that, and the human cost of war. What happens after a war technically ends for people who were caught in the crossfire. These are some of the things I hope we will look at in this conversation. Yogita, I start with you. It's increasingly difficult to report on war, I suppose, as it always was. Because in between competing narratives and trying to navigate through propaganda and the politics and the ideology of it all, how do you understand what's really happening? How do you decipher and separate the noise?
I think that's where the role of, for lack of a better word, I'm not sure I like the term war correspondent or war reporter, because I'm not sure what that really means, to be very honest. But I think being on the ground where a conflict is happening, I think that is why it's really crucial, because it's really the only way you can verify what is happening. And increasingly, I think not only, because of kind of the flurry of information, misinformation, disinformation, it makes it more difficult, but it also makes it more crucial. But the other thing I will say is that actually, the technology and logistics is important in this, because it's also about access, right? And I think that has changed dramatically. Like, for example, in Ukraine, before drones became sort of a major presence in the battlefield, we could actually get to the front lines. I mean, there was always a risk involved, but you could mitigate that risk, in a kind of a structured way. Now it's so difficult, and therefore we're not always getting to the front line. We're not always able to say, okay, this is the advance, that's the advance, or, what the Ukrainian military is saying correct or it's wrong. And so I think technology, like sort of weapons, as they change, it becomes more difficult. And then the third thing is, of course, access. So for example, with the Israel-Gaza war, we have not had access to Gaza at all. Internet journalists from outside, journalists from inside are trying their best to cover it and, are dying while covering it. So I think it's become far more complicated for a number of different reasons. It isn't just about kind of the flurry of information and the pressure to get information quickly because of social media and the internet.
Stanley, one thing we saw, and we've seen this before, but it was probably more systemic this time during Operation Sindoor, is under the garb of trying to fight misinformation and disinformation, the government put together very well-curated, well-crafted narratives. It was pushed, and journalists didn't have enough access to verify it or even question it. There were press conferences held, but you know better than anybody what that was. So tell us what it is to report on conflicts at times like these.
No, in this case, what we have witnessed was a flurry of misinformation, right? And we saw that Indian media, mostly television media, going after all kind of forwards that they would be. I mean, we all were getting forwards on our phone. And some messages might be coming from people associated, linked with the government or a particular department of the government. And we know that Indian media reported that there was a coup in Pakistan. General Asim Munir was in jail, like the Pakistani Prime Minister was in a bunker. I mean, it actually reported, right? Our Indian troops are there in Karachi. Indian Navy opened fire at Karachi. Another story said that there were massive destructions across Pakistani cities. I mean, this is where do this information come from? That's the question. And how can, I mean, when you are reporting for an international, when you are reporting for a mainstream media or TV or a newspaper or whatever, which people take seriously, how do you, play these stories without confirmation? So we faced this sustained efforts to, provide misinformation throughout the conflict, and which did not advance India's interests at all. And that's another question. If you are trying to build a narrative, that effort didn't work at all. On the other side, Indian TV, Indian media came out very, very bad. General Indian media throughout the conflict. And what we have to do is, it's very difficult. I mean, everybody knows that, especially during the time of the conflict, it's very difficult to get proper information. Of course, we had press conferences, and you will have to talk to the people who are responsible. And even if, I mean, you should have, as a journalist, you should have proper access. And sometimes when the conflict is actually happening, the government sources might be tight-lipped. So what you have to do is to, I mean, mostly you need to basically depend on the official sources or official confirmations, press conferences, or as Yogita said, you should be on the ground. And you should be on the ground, you should talk to people on the ground, you should talk to officials and get stories and verify them and then run them, right? Okay, sometimes you make mistakes, it's part of the job, like any other job. But I think the most important thing is that you should not fall prey for this, any kind of sustained misinformation campaign, especially during the time of the conflicts, because during the time of the conflicts, all the propaganda mills will be at work. So I think it's part of the job that you need to be careful not to fall for them, you know? So I think that's what you have to be careful about.
I want to ask you, Nirupama, about what's happening on the other side of the border. There's so much curiosity because as somebody who's reported from Pakistan, how is this conflict with India, I don't mean just Operation Sindoor, but over the decades, how is that viewed by the general public? What is the reportage like there? Because what we see on our TV screens are caricatures, right? The Pakistani panelists are wetted to make sure they appear foolish, say the most nonsensical things. But what is it like? How is war viewed there?
So I just want to say that, in the present conflict, it's still ongoing according to the government. So it hasn't yet stopped. So it's a pause in the war, not a ceasefire. In that, there is what we're seeing is a concerted effort not to understand what's going on the other side. People don't want to hear that. I mean, by people I mean editors also don't want to hear about it. They are chary of getting the other side known. And also, I think there's no appetite among the people also, among viewers, readers, to know what is happening in Pakistan. At least that's a sense I get, because otherwise people would be responding, editors would be responding to that pressure to tell that story as well. But it wasn't always so. There were correspondents, Indian correspondents in Pakistan who reported out of Pakistan. And I think that was an important element of our journalism, at least on the India-Pakistan front. And that is gone forever now. But you asked me, how do people see this whole thing? So Operation Sindoor, I know for a fact that even people who do not like the army are very happy. Although the army played no part on the Pakistan side, the army played no part in Operation Sindoor. Yet you saw that Asim Munir, the army chief, became the field marshal. And the other thing is that they're very happy that, I mean, while in India people think that we emerged victorious from Operation Sindoor, or that is a narrative being put out by the government, on the other side, it's that Pakistan won this war. And but the thing is, normally when I was there in Pakistan, you didn't have a sense that all Pakistanis wanted a war with India. There was a sticking point, and that's Kashmir. I think on the Indian side and on the Pakistani side, among people and among officials, among politicians, there is that blind spot, Kashmir, right? And nobody wants, on the other side, no one wants to compromise. They don't want their politicians to compromise. They don't want the army to compromise. And on our side, the same, of course. But war with India does not figure as a big element in any Pakistani discourse, at least not till the time that I was there.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not what you see on our TV screens, right?
Yeah.
The war Rukwadi Papa is only for Russia-Ukraine war, not as far as India-Pakistan is concerned. You have been in very sane newsrooms. right? Not a luxury many of us have had. How do you navigate through this competitive nationalism where journalists, anchors are perhaps the biggest warmongers of our times, right? They're encouraging war. They're encouraging people to think war is wonderful, war is great. In your newsrooms, the ones that you've been a part of and the one that you head, what are the conversations like on conflicts?
I think that our approach is just diametrically opposite, and I understand in a way, the privilege of being able to work in a setting that bucks the trend that way. I think, Nirupama, we ran a review in Himal about the very few Indian correspondents who have actually been correspondents in Pakistan, with all of the pressures that comes with it, visits from intelligence agencies and all of that. But the reason that we wanted to run that also was to show that it is possible to do this kind of thing within a South Asian context if there is will. I think Hindu is one of the organizations probably that has tried more than most, or more than the rest. There are a few other exceptions, but there is at least an effort. And I think that the power of that is actually very underappreciated. I think the Hindu right now has somebody named Meera Srinivasan, who I'm sure you know, who's sitting in Colombo. And what she has done in terms of actually with immersion, nuance, rigor, being able to report on the immense complexity of what is happening in Sri Lanka, I think that the value of that within India is actually enormous. And yes, this is probably primarily true in South India, because I think that some of the information that she puts out as well is not consumed as widely, let's say, the further north you go. But she's another one of those, I think, very salutary examples of why we need South Asian correspondents in each other's governments. The Indian media, I think, also operates, for all its problems, it operates with at a scale and with economy, or economies of scale also, that no other media in the region can match. And I think that India, as geographically, really, the center of South Asia, I think, has a greater need, I think, and a greater responsibility to actually tell Indians, but also the rest of South Asia about what is happening. And sadly, of course, that responsibility is not being carried by the mainstream Indian media, if we want to call it that. One problem is that there's just simply no investment in these kinds of things. Again, Nirupama, you are such a rare exception. Perhaps you shouldn't be. Perhaps there should be routinely Indian correspondents in Dhaka, Colombo, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the way it is. And Stanley, going back to a point that you made where you were saying, that they're not serving the state interest, right, in the way that this the coverage, let's say, of Operation Sindoor was happening. I mean, let's be honest, right? As a journalist, you are not supposed to serve the state interest. But even if we take for granted that these journalists are trying to do that, the paradox right now of the Indian media, especially as it is perceived in Nepal with what's happened recently and also elsewhere beyond India's immediate borders, is that the journalists are actually making things much, much worse for Indian state interests, even if that is the mission that they are carrying when they go abroad. I mean, look what's happened with Dhaka. Look at the kind of collapse in relations that there has been. And a very big part of that, if you speak to people in Bangladesh, is that they were watching the kind of coverage that was coming out of India. And yes, there were instances of Hindus being facing violence in the aftermath of Sheikh Hasina's fall. But you have to contextualize that. You have to talk about the relative scale of that violence. You have to talk about the fact that a lot of that was people who were being targeted for clear political connections and motives, not to excuse that kind of violence, but there is a different context to it. Whereas in India, it was reported as if all of Bangladesh just wants to murder Hindus, period. I've seen very warped coverage coming out of what's just happened in Nepal. And again, the kind of reputational damage that is doing, we're not just talking about the Indian media, we are talking about bilateral relations and just India's standing in the region. That damage is enormous. And I would imagine that even if you are a self-serving bureaucrat sitting in South Block, you should be saying, put intelligent people in these countries so that we can have something that gives us a valuable and accurate picture of what's going on, lets us make decent decisions, and does not routinely just shoot us as a nation state in the foot over and over and over again.
I think also when we say states' interest, we need to differentiate between a very myopic government interest and the country's interest. And I want to talk about what's happening in Nepal, but I'll come back to that in just a bit. Yogita, you are one of those rare exceptions, especially in the visual medium. I can't think of any other Indian journalist doing that right now, who goes back to a country much after the war has officially ended, right, quote unquote. You've gone back to Afghanistan, for example, many times after that, to see what happens. And do tell us why that's so important, what you find, how people cope with what happens. And if you can talk about the toll a conflict takes on women, like everything else, how women bear the brunt of wars much more than men.
So I think why it's important, again, I was talking about access during a war, and very often in the heat of the conflict, you can't actually get access to lots of places. And then when the war is over, those places open up. So for example, in Afghanistan, I think in the past 4 years, we have been all over the country in a way that we just couldn't have dreamt of doing prior to 2021. And those stories are still there. The stories of, from both sides, I'd say, villages that were entirely bombed out by, by sort of NATO forces, and the people who were left behind and what they feel. We met a guy whose entire family was killed in a bombing. All of them, every single one member of his family. And I think those stories are important to tell, even if they're afterwards, because I feel that's the reason I don't like the word war correspondent. I'm coming back to that is because firstly, every war is different. So I don't think you can be a special, there's no generic kind of war correspondent.
It's not a beat in that sense.
And I don't think it is worth taking any risk. I think you're irreplaceable in your family's life, and it is not worth taking any risk unless you are going there, editorially speaking, because you're going to bring out something or you're going to tell something that actually affects or influences how people think. And so even after the war is over, when that access is opened up, it is really crucial to go back there, get the stories of what happened, because it explains a lot. It explains to you why was the Taliban able to take over this country in 2021 in the way that did. They did. Western forces withdrew, and literally within 10 days they were in Kabul. And it gives you an understanding of why people were opposed to them, which you couldn't necessarily get access to during the war. But obviously you also go back there because now there's a Taliban government in power, and what it is unleashing on its own people, that is a current crucial story to tell. So that's why I think you've got to kind of keep going back. And sometimes it's even when the war's over, it's been 4 years now, but I think it's important to keep telling those stories because hopefully people will remember that for the future. I'm not hopeful on that front, but I see that as my job.
If I can just get in another question on the part of where you said, you shouldn't risk your life. I know it's glamorized way too much. But if you can compare and contrast, you've been part of Indian news channels. You've now been part of an international agency. So what is the difference in how you're trained, the safety protocols, if you can just tell us that?
So I think, that was the biggest difference for me. So I worked with a national news network, and this isn't a comment on that specific national news network because I know everybody around us was doing the same thing, and we covered the 2008 Mumbai attack. And I remember literally sort of being outside these places where gunshots were going off, and we had no protective gear, we had no training whatsoever in terms of how to manage these. And frankly, there were so many journalists outside of the Taj Hotel that honestly, if somebody had just popped their head out of a window and thrown a grenade, there would have been a lot of journalists killed. I think that was the biggest change for me when I joined an international news network, is the amount of consideration and care that goes into deploying into a conflict area. Not only do you have to undergo, actual training, you also before you go to any place, there is actually a risk assessment done, which is done jointly with the team, with your editors, with safety advisors. And sometimes that can happen very quickly because sometimes you've got to deploy really quickly. It's not like you've got ages. You can't sit on a story for 3 days and be like, oh, should we deploy or not? And you can never mitigate risk to zero. So when I say that you should, no story is worth my life is what I feel. Will I take a risk on some situations? Yes, but you've got to be absolutely 100% convinced of why you are going to the place you're going, where you might die. If you think you're going there because bombs will be going off behind you and that'll make you look great. Yeah, fine, you'll do that once. What happens the next time, right? And so I think, and that process, that you go through, it makes you think of that, because the first thing you've got to put on that form is your editorial justification for making that risk. And you've not only got to be convinced as a team, but your editors have to be convinced of it. And, I really, really think those processes are good. The training is good. I've been caught under drones in Ukraine, and the only reason why my mind didn't seize up, I didn't panic, I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm going to die, I don't know what to do next, is because I knew, once you've been trained, your mind kind of almost goes into that space, and you're problem solving for what you should do next. And that's why it's really crucial, because it will happen. I mean, the frequency, and I'm talking about drones a lot, I know, because I've seen them change battlefields, and it's really, really easy to just be caught under one. It's really easy nowadays. And that's why I think people need to train. You can't just go into, war zones without having some amount of training.
Earlier, Nirupama, we were talking about how it's perhaps more challenging to report on a war where your country is involved, as opposed to some, faraway countries where you have your patriotism, loyalty to your government questioned every other day. You have reported on multiple wars. What are the challenges? What's the kind of trolling you've faced, not just on social media, but also from colleagues, perhaps?
So, when there's a war or a conflict in your own country, take Kashmir, for instance. People are watching you, what you write, the terms you use. So, for instance, if you use militants instead of terrorists, there are 1,000 people out there saying, anti-national. You're calling them militants. You should call them terrorists. And you're constantly under watch for this kind of thing. And I think there is a certain comfort level in covering a war in a different country. There, you can hold their army up to human rights violations, you can ask questions, you can, you can do all kinds of things. I remember when I was in Sri Lanka, this was in the mid-90s, and the government was, to all practical purposes, it was losing the war. And there used to be attack after attack by the LTT. And, each time 500 soldiers would get killed and all kinds of things. So in that whole year, I think 3,000 soldiers died. In that decade, from 94 to 2000. Finally, there was a list by the army that gave all the names. It was 3,000 soldiers. Right? And at some point, they decided that they didn't want all this news getting out. So they brought in some kind of censorship. And as foreign correspondents, we all laughed at it, because I would just send my story to Chennai, and there'd be no byline. There'd be a dateline, Chennai dateline, and I know that Reuters was sending it to Singapore, somebody else was sending it, AP was sending it somewhere else. And that's how those stories were getting published. And no one questioned us in that sense about, how are these stories getting published. And so there's a certain, as I said, comfort level in reporting a conflict, but not in this. Operation Sindoor, if anything, was proof that you cannot question your military, you cannot ask how many combat losses there were, you cannot say, you can't even say, we saw that people who did put out that some aircraft fell had to, retract it immediately. So there are all those pressures working on when there is a war in your own country. And I don't think this is peculiar to India. I think it's across the world. But also let me say that, for instance, in the Vietnam War, right, there were American journalists embedded with their army, and they went through all the stuff that the army went through. But that didn't mean they were they brought out this nationalism or anything. You would recall, you may not recall because you may not have been born then, but but there was this huge wave of protests across campuses in America. Nobody wanted to. People wanted the war to end. Mm-hmm. And there was enormous pressure from the campuses, and they said, we are not going to enlist. Right? So journalists there performed that role, even though they were embedded with the military and all that. Over here, I think some of our correspondents are soldiers trapped in journalists' bodies. And
They wear the uniform too.
sometimes they do.
Yes.
And in their studios, in their 4 battlefields in their studios, I just think they should be dropped into the real battle scene and then let's see what happens. Because also the thing about this is you're not even allowed to properly tackle the human side of it. You're speaking about that, right? There's no empathy for people who died.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just another thing. Okay, we've covered it, now move on. Let's move on. So Poonch during Operation Sindoor was a huge, it was the battlefield, really. I mean, the rest of it was fought in the air. But Poonch saw massive destruction on our side. A lot of people died. The place is still destroyed. And people haven't gone back either after the conflict to see how people are doing there. And reporters have not gone back. I mean, that's a story worth doing to find out how are people coping after so many months of Operation Sindoor, what help has reached them, how have they reconstructed their lives, their houses, families, and so on. So yeah, that's...
The trauma of war is not something that's reported on enough.
That's not,
Yeah.
because war is supposed to be, let's go out and kill them all and come back alone.
Yeah. And
That's
the graphics on our TV screens,
Yeah.
oh my God. I want to talk about the context of wars because your books talk about it, and most often than not, I read them to get the context. But how important is that? Because the Hamas, the conflict in Israel and Palestine, which is now a full-blown genocide, did not start on the 7th of October. And when a reporter or even your reader doesn't know that context, then you don't understand why what's happening is happening. So tell us how important that context setting is.
Yeah, it's very important, especially in this case. I mean, if you can look at any context, any conflict. So in the case of Israel-Palestine, I mean, everybody, those who are cheering for, I mean, I have seen all kind of comments. I have seen all kind of comments on TV, online, on Twitter, saying that Israel has to finish the job and Israel has the right to defend. I mean, you listen to any mostly European or Western diplomats or government ministers, I mean, they will criticize Israel, and at the moment they will also say that Israel has the right to defend itself, as if what is going on in Gaza is Israel defending itself. Against whom? That's the question, 2.3 million people. So I think this context is very important. In the case of Israel-Palestine, it's very clear that, yes, what happened on October 7 is horrendous. I mean, if you ask me to condemn it, I condemn it. There is no doubt, no question about it. But why did it happen? What was the situation in Gaza before October 7? And what is the situation in the West Bank? And it didn't start on October 7. It's been going on. And in the West Bank in 2023 itself, before the October 7 attack happened, some 200 Palestinians were shot by the Israeli military. And Gaza had been under an Israeli blockade since 2007. Israel says that, we all talk to Israeli diplomats, Israeli ministers, have covered the conflict, and the Israelis would tell you that we left Gaza in 2005. We just let the Palestinians have their state, but they continue to attack us. Terror continues to haunt us, so that's why we are forced to respond to this. No, I mean, yes, the Israeli troops withdrew from Gaza. Israeli troops withdrew settlers from Gaza, but Gaza has always been under Israeli blockade. I wanted to go to Gaza in 2018 and 2015. I was not able to go to Gaza because the Israelis didn't let me go in. I went to the West Bank. West Bank at that time was still open for journalists. Now it's not possible. So Israelis decided who has to go in, who can come out. Israelis and Egyptians as well, because Rafah crossing was controlled by the Egyptians. So it was a blockade imposed by both Egypt and Israel. So everything was controlled, right? So this context is missing. And the bigger question is, there is no Palestinian state. So why the Palestinians? I mean, of course, you can condemn the militant resistance of the Palestinians. I mean, especially when those resistance target civilians on the other side. No two sides about it. But why? Why there is a resistance? Why the Palestinians continue to fight? Because they don't have a state. I mean, the two-state solution has been a promise from 1947 onwards. At least from 1993 onward, this is a promise that has been endorsed by most of the international community, from the United States to India. Everybody says that we support two-state solution, but where is the second state? There is no state at all, right? I mean, now Britain, France, everybody is coming out and recognizing the Palestinian state, but you can't even identify the Palestinian state on the map. So I think this is important. So you need to ask this question that when did it begin? Or what was the context? And then you can of course condemn violence on both sides, but I think it's important to understand why the conflict has been going on and what could be a just solution to this conflict. Is it Israel going and finishing off, quote unquote, the job? Or is it finding a solution to the Palestinian question, which could provide peace to both peoples, right? Both Israelis and the Palestinians. So I think, it is also part of the job. You don't have to opinionate it. You just have to report the facts. That's it.
Yeah.
It
it isn't just viewers and readers and the journalists. I forgot to add that world leaders too need the context, because the India-Pakistan conflict has not been going on for 1,000 years, as we all know. But if anybody has access to who you're not talking about, please tell him that. I want to talk about the Nepal war/conflict, whatever word you want to choose. Tell us how the Gen Z protest started and how difficult it was, because there is so much at stake for all of you. We know the kind of anger, but you cannot simplify it. But you still need to update people. It's very fast-paced. So tell us how that was like.
I think that one of the things that there's almost a rush to impose meaning on events, and I think that this is part of the acceleration of news that the internet has brought out. Sometimes it's good when information comes super fast. Sometimes there is a reason why there is a day 1 story, a day 2 story, a day 3 story, and there is time to process, and there is time to bring in somebody who might have a slightly higher level understanding of a region, of a conflict, rather than relying on just the person who's there on the ground. Sometimes I think that that can become a little bit unfair, right? You're just reporting that X is burning and Y has happened. But there is this rush to impose meaning. And I think that one of the things that happened in the recent conflict, conflict maybe not exactly the right word, but certainly, revolution perhaps, that might be too much of an exaggeration. But you had a lot of journalists who were coming in, Indian journalists included, but also others, who were under pressure to make sense of things so quickly that they were just choosing the easiest preset box. Internet ban, people love internet, must rise up against internet ban. That wasn't the point, right? That was one factor, but it was a much wider set of causes. So I think that was one of the things that was very noticeable. I think on the Indian media and the way that the Indian media distinguished itself, I think probably most of you know quite a bit. So I think that, from the Nepal point of view, I think that, I think one thing that, again, the Indian media, and again, I think, here we're preaching to the choir. Perhaps there's somebody out there through the cameras who's working in some of the other newsrooms also listening. I think some Indians were taken aback that the term Godi media is very widely used and very widely understood in Nepal as well. Godi media is now world famous, right? And India is leading the way. One of the many things that India is now #1 at, unfortunately, right? And I think, just thinking through some of the things that you were saying, and where does all of this end, right? I think that from a regional perspective, and as somebody, I've worked in India, I've kept an outsider's perspective as well. And I think that sometimes there's a need for maybe also independent voices and independent media to point out the larger patterns that are at play. One of the things that I was saying when trying to explain what was happening in in Nepal to Indian audiences, Dhanya had me on an interview actually, where we were talking about this, and I had said that what's happening is that the domestic priorities and politics of the Indian media and the Indian government, it is very hard to untangle those two nowadays, are actually playing out across borders. So when you had Indian journalists parachuting into Kathmandu, their first question is Nepal now going to become a Hindu Rashtra again, right? And again, that is not what this was about in Nepal at all. But it is deeply revealing about the priorities and the politics of the Indian state, and the Indian media, the mainstream Indian media, is an organ of the Indian state for all intents and purposes. if you care to, and you come and you actually interview a generally representative selection of Nepalis, we will tell you that Hindu Rashtra is a terrible idea. We had to go through a civil war to get out of that. Is that what the Indian media wants to hear right now? No. And I think similarly, there's also, sometimes it's easy, I think, that, to respond with humor. And I also laugh at these guys, don't get me wrong, right? But sometimes it's much more serious than it's not something we can laugh at, because what does this all add up to, right? I mean, you were talking about Israel in that context. When you have the Indian channels backing Israel to the hilt, that is an act of Islamophobia within the Indian context. And again, it's the priorities and agendas of the Indian state, as it currently is, filtering into the media. Now, in Israel, the Palestinian movement, or the Palestinian resistance movement, did not start on the 7th of August, but the ongoing genocide did not start on the 7th of October either. That also has a much deeper history. It has a history of decades of the Israeli state in small steps, increasingly vilifying Muslims to the point that genocide becomes possible. And this is widely established. There are scholars of genocide who have listed all the various steps. That's happening right here, right? Is that where we end?
I'm being told we have 5 minutes, but if I can take a quick response.
One thing about Nepal. So one of the Indian channels ran a story saying that the former Prime Minister's wife was burned to death.
No verification.
Verification, what?
They got, exactly,
what?
The V word, right? You don't say that word in this context
Dirty
anymore.
words.
No verification. Yeah. They killed the wrong person to start with. They killed the wrong former Prime Minister's wife. Anyway, yes, it was a huge mess.
So I'm going to quickly take 2-3 questions. Please keep your questions short, brief. We have very limited time. Start with the gentleman on the...
So most often the internal score settling, like especially in Kerala's context, how the Christian right-wing groups use the attack on Israel and Palestine. So how that also influenced the foreign policies when it comes to a larger context?
Is your question to Stanley? Okay.
I'll answer it now. Yes, okay. So in the larger context influencing foreign policy, I think generally the right wing in India is, I don't know, they seem to be in love with Israel. So that might have an influence on foreign policy. In the context of Kerala, yes, we see this in the last 5 years. We have started noticing it, especially among Christians, particularly those who are active on social media, young Christians, the youth. They are overtly in favor of Israel. I mean, not just that, they are supporting everything Israel is doing. So you also have this organization called CASA, which is a right-wing organization, which is in, kind of very close to the Hindutva right-wing organizations. So they have the same narrative which they are peddling on social media and on TV, on YouTube interviews, etc., etc. And their argument is that the Palestinians are begging for what the Israelis are doing now because they are the source of terrorism. And what Israel is doing is only fighting terrorism by killing 65,000 people in 24 months. So this is their narrative. So their argument is that this is a battle between civilization and barbarian terrorism. And that narrative is very strong. And I know this because I come under a lot of attack for my positions on Palestine, and I also get forwards from my own family members. So this is, this is very pervasive in Kerala now.
No, but that's story of all our lives. Next question.
Yes, hi. I think it's a question that's maybe mostly one that Yogita can answer, although others may have seen this happen. And I ask this because of your experience in Ukraine. I was wondering if you are thinking by now about how, with the very fast dissemination of stories in the way that a lot of us are combining, I think, in frontline reporting, things like verification, satellite stuff. If these stories that you do disseminate might in turn affect operational decisions from the armies that you're supposed to be covering. Have you seen that coming back to either of the sides' operational decisions?
Of either of the armies, No, I would say no. I haven't seen that happening, to be very honest. I think there is an element, again, and sorry, I'm just going to go back to sort of how these things happen. Again, when you go to a front line, sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes you actually have to embed with the military. And so when you're embedding with the military, especially if you're in control rooms and places like that, there will be operationally sensitive things that you film. And so you do have an agreement usually with them that they review only the pictures, not editorially what you're saying, not the bit of their interviews that you're keeping in, not the story that you're stitching together, just so that it doesn't affect someone's safety, so it's that someone's life is not at risk. And when you do that, I think it's really important to tell people that you have done that you've gone to a front line with the Ukrainian military or with whoever it is, and that, what did you allow them? Like, did you allow them to review kind of the pictures to make sure that there wasn't anything that was going to affect them operationally? So I think you've got to be as honest as possible with your audience. But I think your question is slightly different. It's about whether... the thing is, I think militaries all over the world have gotten really smart about that. They will not talk about the stuff that actually affects them, which is why you don't get numbers from most places of how many, you get numbers for civilians, you don't get numbers for how many soldiers have been killed. And I think that's true of pretty much, I think, every conflict you've seen. I mean, like when I watched it, I've seen it in Ukraine, I've seen it in India, I have seen it in Afghanistan as well, that, when the Taliban were kind of rapidly taking territory, there was a strong denial from the other side of any such thing happening. So I think we're actually usually not privy to that information. We don't get to that information. There are times when I think you have to, and again, this is where you have to have processes internally. You have to have editorial policy that directs that if you are putting out something, is that going to put anyone's life at risk? It doesn't matter whose. And I do think you need to consider that. When you're kind of disseminating that information. But in my experience, it has never come to that stage because I think militaries have become very smart about it.
Maybe the last question, yeah.
In context to what is happening in Ladakh right now, there was a statement that sort of went viral across mainstream media, which said that the protests in Ladakh are, Sonam Wangchuk was instigating sort of Nepal-like Gen Z protests in Ladakh. And this is the sort of rhetoric that is there across mainstream media. So how do you think it affects, especially bilateral relations when there's an already strife situation going on in a neighboring state? And how does such callous statements reduce the cost of any real protest that is going on across?
Right. You want to take that?
I think it's also, information can be used for various purposes, right? And I think, again, there is also, is it a theory? I don't know. There is a pattern, right? That you've had Sri Lanka, then Bangladesh, then Nepal. One of the questions that I saw being tossed around online in India, when Nepal was happening, you had one set of people saying, when is our Bangladesh-Nepal moment going to come? You had another set saying, Modi has to hold this country together. It's because Modi is so great and so strong that we've not had our Bangladesh-Sri Lanka moment yet. I think that in Ladakh, I think that there is an attempt to overplay perhaps that statement from Sonam Wangchuk to try and make it seem like there was an attempt to foment something like a national counter-revolution. I don't know what they're trying to push with that, right? So I think that, it is in the nature of people, and especially in today's day and age, right? I think that part of what's happening is that with the collapse of old business models, you're also seeing the collapse of old patterns of information dissemination, right? So it's not like the government in Delhi can control, or even without censorship oftentimes, still it's the newspapers that are going to filter what's happening in Nepal through a certain lens before that information is delivered, let's say, to somebody in Ladakh. So I think that there is a certain nervousness within the Indian government as well. I think that that's true of every government. We talk about youth uprisings in South Asia, and there's Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. But even in Bangladesh, I think, I'm mixing countries up. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal, you've already seen what's happened. In Pakistan, there is a strong argument to be made that what's been happening around Imran Khan is also an expression of really deep-seated and really explosive youth discontent, right? And it's not just youth within Pakistan, there are ethnic lines, but there's lots of complexity there, right? I think that the fact that there is so much nervousness around Sonam Wangchuk having said that, I think is reflective of the fact that in India, a lot of the same frustrations exist as well, right? And I think that the Indian state, it doesn't have to come to these kinds of explosions, right? But that's down to responsible governments and an effective political system that is able to address people's problems and grievances without it having to come to this. In Nepal, we failed at that, right? I don't, and I'll be very clear on this, I hope it never comes to that in India, because I think an explosion here will be on a magnitude and a level of chaos that should never happen. So I would like to see not just the BJP government in Delhi, but state governments, every organ of government taking it seriously enough when you have these kinds of symptoms of discontent and trying to solve them through the democratic systems that are supposed to solve them so that it never comes to that.
That's all the time we have. I feel like we were just getting started, but we have to end it. But if any of you have questions and the panelists are willing to take, you can speak to them outside. Thank you.
Thank you.